Okay, let's begin our afternoon sessions, and we have two sessions this afternoon, so a lot to cover. Our moderator, Lisa Brady, has taken ill, so John Freemuth will fill in for both panels this afternoon. John Freemuth is well known not only for his long tenure as a Boise State professor in the Departments of Political Science and Public Administration, where he teaches environmental and public land policy, but he also guides the relatively new Masters of Public Administration program. In addition, John is known as an advocate for reasoned solutions to natural resource and public policy issues. Dr. Freemuth will be the moderator of this panel and the next panel also. And I should mention that about 3 o'clock, our high school student friends will be leaving to go home. So when they suddenly rise and leave, it's not a reflection on the panel or something. They have to leave. But Dr. Freemuth.
Thank you, Gary. So when I do my classes, I tell students of the importance of understanding history to know why we are here today and the reasons for it, and then it's up to the next generation to decide what to do with it and change it and make it better. But with that said, we have 4 panelists who have played various roles in this discussion of wilderness searching the past. 2 of them are professors or scholars, and 2 of them are scholar activists, I guess you would say, to a point. In the order of the program, but not necessarily in the way they speak. I'm not sure how we're going to do that. We'll do that real fast. Maybe we will do it that way. First is Dennis Baird, right to my right, Professor Emeritus at the University of Idaho, former board member of the Idaho Environmental Council, and a negotiator for the Gospel Hump Wilderness, and the author of numerous books on wilderness. Next to him is Dr. Sarah Dant. She's a professor of history and teaches courses on the American West and environmental history at Weber State University, co-author of the Encyclopedia of American National Parks, and the forthcoming The Environment in the West, a History, which, if she's lucky, and it ought to be, will be soon used in university classes, hopefully around the West. Then right next to me is Jerry Jane. He is a retired scientific computer programmer at the Idaho National Laboratory, former secretary of the Hells Canyon Preservation Council, and an advocate for the Greater Sawtooth Preservation Council and the River of No Return Wilderness. And finally, next to him is Dr. Mark Madison. He is a historian for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, and he manages the records, the archives, and the museum of that said agency, and he teaches courses at the National Conservation Training Center. So I think we will go in the order that they're in your program: Dennis, Sarah, Jerry, and Mark. It'll be like what you've seen. They will have some comments for 10 or 12 minutes, then we're going to throw it open to you to ask questions. So with that, Dennis.
Thanks so much for having me down from Moscow to speak to you today. My mission is to tell you the story of the Gospel Hump Wilderness, which, among other things, has a faintly obscene name, but it's actually named for Buffalo Hump and the Gospel Mountains on the far end. I'm going to tell you the story. With luck, though, a lesson or two or a how to do it better element will pop up and make the story even more useful. My own career in Idaho began a long time ago. My family always came west from Michigan, where I lived, and we were frequent visitors to the state. After I spent a couple of horrible years in the United States Army as an infantryman, I moved to Illinois and worked on wilderness in southern Illinois, in the small part of the state that the glaciers never flattened. Nearly killed off Doug Scott, who spoke to you this morning, in a horrible accident involving hornets. And then 40 years ago, I moved to Moscow and began to work for the University of Idaho, and had the good fortune there to meet a bunch of people who changed my life. Not the least of them is my wife, Lynn, who still works for the university. I'm a kept man and proud of it. And I met Mort Brigham, a wonderful character from Lewiston, Idaho. Mort was a 1936 graduate of the University in Forestry. He contracted polio shortly after he graduated, and had a rough life in many ways. He worked for various timber companies, but they quickly fired him because they sensed right away that he actually cared about wild places from a very early age onward. Mort's father founded the University of Idaho in the territorial legislature, so it's an old family. Mort is now dead, I'm sorry to say, but he was a wonderful man and a great mentor and a great teacher to me. And Mort always said that his business was designing sawmills, which is how he eventually earned his living, and his hobby was closing them down. And there was a certain amount of truth to that in Mort's life. I met a wonderful woman, besides my wife, a woman named Doris Milner, whose name you maybe heard mentioned here today, from Hamilton, Montana, who played a huge role in Idaho conservation and had a great fondness for Maker's Mark bourbon, as do I, and so we bonded right away. And I learned a lot from Doris Milner, who headed the Montana Wilderness Association and played a key role in saving the upper Selway River from ill-advised timber. And so those are the people who influenced me. Mort was the man who invented the Mallard-Larkins Wilderness Proposal. He was a hunter and fisherman, so he knew every inch of northern Idaho north of the Salmon River. He didn't know much about Idaho south of Salmon, but that was tough luck. He didn't really care. Mort was the father of Kelly Creek and Cayuse Creek, what's now the Great Burn Wilderness Proposal. That was Mort's idea. Mort devoted much of his life to enlarging the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness area. In particular, a valley called Meadow Creek, which is the great tributary of the Selway River. Meadow Creek is not wilderness yet today, but it's still wild thanks to Mort's work and some work by me and a lot of other people. So Mort was the great inventor of many of the wilderness notions, some of which are settled and some of which remain unsettled. And Doris was his great ally in the long fight to save the upper Selway River. So those were my teachers. Many of you, some of you are high school students yet. Years from now, you'll probably remember a teacher or a couple teachers who you can look back on, someone who really offered you a turn in your life and some good guidance, and that was Mort for me and Doris. Mort had some virtues that came into play in the Gospel Hump fight and in wilderness in general. One was tenacity. Mort began to talk about Meadow Creek in 1948. A long, long time ago. He was the first person to figure out that the Selway River needed all of its major tributaries intact if it was going to stay the great river of the West the Selway is. The Selway runs crystal clear even in high water when there's mud. Every other river in Idaho, the Selway is clear blue and deeply inviting. Mort had a vast knowledge of the land, and that is another criteria, I think, as you look at wilderness as a useful thing to be working on in your life. Having that knowledge on the ground. Mort could tell you where a good camping spot was on about 12,000 miles, it seemed like to me, of trails in northern Idaho. You go up this creek about 2 miles, and there's a little flat over there, and there's good water coming out of a little spring. He just knew all that. So he had vast knowledge, which I've worked for 40 years to try and get a little kernel of equivalency in my life. And Mort, being a sawmill designer and a forester and a wood gatherer, he cut firewood for years after the sawmills all fired him. Mort appreciated logging as a useful thing to be doing, as a good way of life, as a home for many fine people. And so Mort's role as a wilderness advocate included, let's get the loggers doing a better job and let's keep them in business so they'll be around and their children will be around to do that for a long time. And that helped a lot. You can't overestimate the value of that experience. Well, the Gospel Hump region is east of Grangeville on the South Fork of the Clearwater River. So if you drive from Grangeville out the South Fork Canyon to Elk City, the Gospel Hump region is off to the south. At the time we began to debate it in the 1970s, it was about 400,000 acres, mostly roadless. There was one little road up through the middle to the Sourdough Lookout. The Forest Service at the time was doing what was called unit planning, and some would have called that nickel and diming things to death. So those 400,000 acres were chopped up into lots of little planning decisions, not a one of which took a look at the big picture. There was no notion of a holistic look at the land, at those 400,000 acres. Instead, we're going to have lots of little looks, and nowhere along the line was anybody in the Forest Service going to look at wilderness as a possible land allocation for some of the Gospel Hump region. Well, to me and Mort and others, that didn't seem like a smart thing to do. Luckily, we realized that those 400,000 acres had lots of things possible in them. Wilderness was one of them. There was a lot of wildlife. There was a dude rancher in the middle of it. There was a possibility, because much of the Gospel Hump region is not too steep, there was a good chance of some sound logging that could go on in there. All those were possibilities, but the Forest Service was only looking at where to build roads and where to log. We just couldn't get their attention. As luck would have it, in the state of Colorado, there had been a court decision on this very issue, on nickel and diming, on chopping up wilderness into little pieces, potential wilderness into little pieces. And so Mort and I learned of that and began to wonder what we could do about that. Well, then came along serendipity, another useful thing which you can invite into your life if you're lucky. In this case, it was in the form of an employee of the Northwest office of the Sierra Club named Dave Pavlicek, who was a genius at understanding Forest Service administrative law. And so Mort and I talked to Dave. We'll talk about his boss, Doug Scott, here in a bit. And Dave said, well, there is a way to get their attention. We can just sue their butts up one side and down the other. Or in this case, we used the administrative appeals process and basically brought the unit planning process to a halt, which was interesting, but that didn't produce any wilderness. And neither Mort nor I were quite sure, having done that, what next. We'd stopped the bad things, but that wasn't creating anybody's jobs, that wasn't saving an acre of wilderness, that wasn't settling anything. Well, the other players in the process were Frank Church, who we are honoring in ways that we can't even begin to do an adequate job of here today, and his remarkable staffer, who was, at least a little while ago, was sitting in the back of the room, Larry LaRocco. And so the commercial interests of Idaho County went to Senator Church and said, things are just bollocksed up here. Things have ground to a halt. What can you do about it, Frank? And Frank said, well, we can start getting people together to see if we can hash this out. And here's my ace staffer, LaRocco, who can do all the work, which he ended up doing. And so Larry LaRocco and Senator Church put a huge effort and some amount of courage to do it, dragged the citizenry. In this case, it was mostly me. Mort was there a lot, but Mort was in poor health at the time. And so what seemed like hundreds of hours were spent in meetings. Doug Scott described some of those. Larry described some of them earlier. Just a vast labor. Aided by the fact that the conservation proponents had a vision for the Gospel Hump region that included a lot of things. We thought there was a really good chance for 250,000 acres of wilderness in the steep, stunningly beautiful mountainous part of the region. But Mort and I were then, and I still am, deeply sympathetic to the needs of the timber industry in this state. It's a wonderful industry. It's improved itself over the last 20 years. They tend to do a really great job in the woods. That's the reality of it. And Mort and I and the other proponents of the Gospel Hump Wilderness realized all along that there had to be something in there for job creation and job protection. And that's what Larry LaRocco was particularly good at. He was good at that when he went to Congress, too. And so we worked for days and days and days. I got married in the middle of all that and went away on a honeymoon and was trapped at the Seattle airport. You've got to get back. Things are going to hell in a handcart in the negotiations. And so right off the plane from my honeymoon, I was back in the work of trying to cut a deal for the Gospel Hump region, which we did. So it took the knowledge that Mort had, and I to a lesser extent. It took a sentiment on the part of conservationists that there were many useful things that come out of the Gospel Hump region, and I think that's often a key to settling any of these issues. You heard Congressman Simpson talk about that very issue. And it took, on the part of the timber industry, some notion of trust. They had to believe that, number one, Congress would pass legislation that would benefit them if there was going to be wilderness. You get yours, we get ours. That was the theory, seemed fair. And they also had to believe that Dennis Baird and Mort Brigham and the other people would deliver the goods. to the end of time, or at least to the end of our lives. That if we cut a deal in the 1970s, in 2014, if someone came along and said, well, this deal is not working out, people have long memories around here, I would have to do something about it. And that has actually happened a couple times. So the notion of trust is another one of those little lessons, I think, in these kind of wilderness battles. Those of you who are proponents of wilderness, and that includes me, the job is nowhere near done, have to be believed, and no matter how much it hurts, you have to deliver the goods. Even though you deeply regret what you promised 20 years ago, a deal's a deal's a deal, and you just can't begin to go back on those. And the folks you're dealing with have to know that. They have to believe when you say that, yes, I will be there and to defend this deal to the last days. So we filed those administrative appeals, things stopped. Luckily, the stoppage was helped by the fact that the Office of the General Counsel of the Forest Service had a couple of attorneys in it who were kind of friendly and called us up and said, what do you guys really want? And we said, well, we want some wilderness, but we want some jobs. And that aided things a lot, got the process moving right along. It also helped that the commercial interests in Idaho County, namely the Grangeville Chamber of Commerce and others, were driven by job creation. And I've always said, and I think it's true, the very best day to complete the wilderness system in Idaho is when there's full employment in the woods. When people are afraid and worried and nervous and wondering what's going to happen to their kids, that is not a good day to talk about the big W. And so we had in the Grangeville Chamber of Commerce and commercial interests in Idaho County pragmatists, people who just wanted to get some jobs. And they weren't against wilderness as a notion. They just wanted some kind of deal that would benefit them as it benefited people like me. So the negotiations were long. Poor LaRocco drove thousands of miles, never got any sleep. His wife forgot who he was. His kids disowned him, I think. Anyhow, he put in a lot of time on it, as did the rest of us. And we delivered a piece of legislation. And along came Doug Scott, who spoke to you this morning, one of the great evil geniuses of the Northwest conservation world, who at that time was cooking up a new scheme called the Endangered American Wilderness Act. And so we had this deal cut in Idaho County, about what to do with it. And well, there was this bill that Doug had, so we just slipped it right in with that one. And we had hearings in Washington as part of a big package, and Congress passed it. We had a hearing in Grangeville, which was quite lively, that involved a porta-gallows. You don't see those too often out in front of the hearing. There were large numbers of heavily armed policemen in the building to assist, but it got done. And one of my fond memories, which I'll always have, was when a certain creepy fellow got up and really just ragged on Senator Church about the notion of wilderness. How could you possibly, as a true American, as a patriot, on and on and on, lock up all this land and throw away the key and destroy jobs and so on? And Frank Church delivered, all his life, delivered wonderful speeches that when he started the speech, he knew where it was going to end, unlike me or most of you. Frank knew when it was going to end. But he delivered a reply to that admonition that he got from a young fellow from Clarkston that was eloquent, moving, touching, and powerful. It was a powerful defense of why wilderness is a good thing and a humble thing and a truly American thing to value. And I'll never forget that speech. It was a marvelous occasion. Well, since we passed the law, we have a 206,000-acre Gospel Hump wilderness. We have done a lot of logging in the flatter country south of there. We've had a few people who thought that the whole deal was wretched and I should do something about it. And what I would do about it is say, well, deal's a deal's a deal. That's it. Tough luck. Or you could have been there. What you get is what you get. And to this day, the conservation community has honored all the parts of that agreement, which is a very complex one. The timber industry has honored every last part of it. There's only one little nickel and diming on the process, and that was done by the Forest Service, who played a dirty trick on me by moving the wilderness boundary a silly 50 feet when I wasn't looking, and they got away with it. So I made life really unpleasant for the ranger who did that, who retired shortly thereafter and has not been seen again. And at some point before I die, I want to get that 50 feet back, because that was a dirty trick, and it doesn't seem like much, but 50 feet is 50 feet. So that's the Gospel Hump Wilderness. A few lessons. It does involve lots of trust, a vast amount of knowledge on the ground. It involves knowing that your word will be kept, no matter what the deal is. And it sure involves a lot of tenacity. We've heard about that. You don't get into this racket of promoting wilderness as a life's work, which I've done not for money, but just because it seems like the right thing to do. You don't get into it for a couple of 3 years and then we'll move on to playing polo or something like that. No, you've got to really stick to it for a long, long time. So I think that's the story of Gospel Hump, and maybe a lesson of some utility. Thanks for having me.
Well, thank you all for coming today. I think that one of the themes that we have certainly seen that has begun to become very apparent is this idea of you care about what you know. There's obviously a lot of passion about places, both local and national, here at this conference, represented in this room. And we've heard a lot about the importance of citizen involvement and initiative, so I want to focus on what comes next after citizens decide they have a place that they want to protect. And maybe I should more precisely say who comes next. And I realize I'm pitching a pretty fat fastball to talk about Frank Church at the Frank Church Conference, but hey, I'm going to pander. Absolutely. It's hard to imagine in some ways the environmental movement without talking about individuals, John Muir, Rachel Carson, Howard Zahniser, but I'm going to argue that we also need to talk about Frank Church, because without Frank Church, Idaho certainly, but actually the nation in general, would have been a lot poorer. His contributions to wilderness, wild rivers, land conservation were not only in the legislation that he succeeded in passing, but also the way he went about passing those laws. As one advocate recalled, Frank did not come across as a crusader for wilderness, but rather as a quieter, careful workman who crafted deft compromises and accommodations. So I want to talk a little bit about Frank Church first. I love this photo. When Frank Church took office in 1957, he was only 32 years old. He was green, but not necessarily in the environmental sense. His campaign in 1956 had promised to build your Idaho. And that's what he thought he wanted to do, attract industry, economic development to this state. But he was also a very quick study, and he quickly came to understand that unbounded development was not only an unrealistic goal for Idaho and the nation, but also a very undesirable one. He was a very pragmatic politician, but he was keenly aware that all Americans did not share his conservation zeal. But he did not try to then simply just outshout them, but instead pioneered a model of consensus building and cooperation that incorporated competing concerns and demands and accomplished environmental ends through diplomatic negotiation and compromise. Church's support and affinity for the environment grew out of his deep appreciation of the wild Idaho of his youth. Church was a third-generation Idahoan who'd spent his boyhood with his family, recreating, and his friends throughout this very scenically spectacular and rather sparsely populated state. I have this great quote about not waking up on an Idaho mountainside, but good heavens, I think every single person has said that here at the conference, so I'm not going to. But one of the things that happened is that Church could take this boyhood love of place, this place he knew so well, and translate it then into a Senate career that was really about protecting not only wild Idaho, but the last and best places in this country. And he sought to achieve what he thought was a practicable balance between development and preservation. So while he consistently secured reclamation and multiple use projects for the state, which some people in this room dinged him for, He also believed that some of the wild and untamed places of his Idaho childhood deserved to be protected. And so his commitment to wilderness preservation and the protection of free-flowing rivers really came out of this personal conviction. So, as you well know, church played an important role in the initial wilderness bill, shepherding it through the labyrinth of Congress, offering key amendments to the bill in the hopes that it would facilitate its movement through Congress in a more consensus-building way, I think. His measured and thoughtful presentations tried to assure user interest that wilderness designations would not lock up, that's that famous concern, would not lock up valuable natural resources, and indeed that wilderness could become its own valuable resource. As he said, and we had a question about the economics of wilderness in a panel earlier, and Church, I think, had a really great answer to that. He said, wilderness areas will become a mighty magnet for the tourist trade. Few industries have as much potential for us. So on September the 3rd, when Lyndon Johnson signed the bill into law, Church is right there. He's looking over his shoulder. And lest you think that, oh, well, he's kind of relegated to the margins, let me tell you that the Interior Secretary of the time, Stuart Udall, said that Church was one of the 2 or 3 people in Congress deserving the greatest credit for its passage. And Stuart Udall's brother, Morris Udall, was a representative from Arizona, and he said simply, without Church, there was no wilderness bill. So this senator had a tremendous influence. And Church's advocacy for the Wilderness Act had been a risk in conservative Idaho, that's certain. But by the 1960s, he believed that most Idahoans were willing to support environmental legislation as long as they didn't view it as a threat to their livelihood, as he himself said. If it really is a choice of conservation or their job, they'll take their job. But as long as it's sensible conservation and propaganda about the loss of their jobs that they can sort out, they'll take conservation. At the same time that he was embroiled in the wilderness controversy, Church was also wrestling with the dam controversy, that's a DAM, dam controversy on the Snake River. Competing proposals there pitted public and private power companies against one another in a race to put a plug in Hell's Canyon. And Church himself later said that the Hell's Canyon controversy was not ever about, at least initially, whether or not a dam would be built, but who was going to build it and when they were going to build it. But Church was an early supporter initially of a dam in Hell's Canyon, a big federal dam. But one of the other proposals threatened to block the river of no return, the salmon. And that was a cost that Church was simply not willing to pay. So in 1959, he proposed something called the Salmon River Preservation Bill. That prohibited the licensing of dams on the Salmon River that would flood established spawning grounds. Now, ultimately, that bill didn't go anywhere in Congress. So what Church decided to do instead was draw upon his involvement in wilderness, draw upon his involvement in Hell's Canyon, and recreate this Salmon River Preservation Bill into a much broader national rivers bill. It was designed to protect sections of some of the nation's scenic rivers, not just one river in Idaho, from economic development. And he absolutely believed that this would be a working partner to wilderness. And Church believed that wild rivers, as he said, would eventually take their place alongside the landmark Wilderness Act as another first for America. Yet, while Church believed the Wild Rivers proposal was an important companion to wilderness, he was also quick to emphasize the differences between wilderness and wild rivers. Most importantly, he noted, the Wild Rivers Bill does not seek to create corridors of wilderness through which these rivers will flow. Rather, the philosophy of multiple use will prevail, allowing grazing, timber harvest, mining, and road building to continue. The Wild Rivers Bill, though, did block dams. Church was certainly not anti-dam. In fact, he called himself a devoted advocate of dams for Idaho. But he also advocated balanced management of water resources that favored, as he said in his classic Church, neither the farmer's spade, the angler's hook, nor ready kilowatt switch. Though he strongly believed that some rivers, like the Snake, ought to be harnessed, he also believed that other rivers, like the salmon, ought to be left in their unblemished splendor. And for him, the Pacific Northwest had the advantage, of course, of really cheap hydropower, but it had paid the price with its fisheries, and that was too high a price. So Church considered the Wild Rivers system an essential weapon in the fight to save Idaho's dwindling salmon and steelhead runs. Once a dam is built, he argued, a wild river is lost forevermore. Church's Wild Rivers bill enjoyed widespread, bipartisan, congressional support. Legislators viewed it as kind of pork barrel conservation. And in October of 1968, his Wild and Scenic Rivers proposal became law. And in its final form, the new system included 3 categories for preservation. So you can see the consensus-building, compromise nature right here in the bill itself. This was a concession designed to please almost everyone and ensured maximum river corridor protection. The law also immediately protected 8 rivers, including the salmon, and prohibited the licensing of dams or other projects on any of the rivers within the system. So compromise in the best sense, cooperation, pragmatic politics, all those words that Congressman Simpson said were now being hurled as epithets. Those actually form the core of Church's legislative legacy. In addition to his efforts on behalf of wilderness and wild rivers, Church also honed his coalition-building expertise by protecting Idaho's sawtooths and also Hell's Canyon. In 1972, he successfully capped a 12-year campaign to protect central Idaho's rugged Sawtooth Mountains as a national recreation area. He had initially hoped that he could get a national park out of the Sawtooths, as did many enviros here in the state, but he acknowledged that the state's resource industries were pretty vehemently opposed to such restrictive designation. And advocates had challenged him to continue to push for a park, but Church was pragmatic. And as he said, if we begin with a recreation area, we might eventually have a park. But if we go back to the park proposal, we might never even get a recreation area. In the end, Church met most environmentalist demands as well, because the new Sawtooth National Recreation Area set aside 217,000 acres of wilderness and included a total mineral withdrawal for mining. Church's coalition of Sawtooth supporters was really impressive. In many ways, it is what I like to argue the foundation for what Congressman Simpson is pulling at this point, which was to incorporate ranchers, local landholders, the Idaho Outdoor Association, the Sierra Club, the state legislature, the Idaho Environmental Council, even the timber industry. It was not a park, he conceded to one constituent, but as he said, it was the most I could get at the time. Getting action in Congress depends on lining up the votes. I work in a political forum where success usually depends on some measure of accommodation. I try to be effective without compromising end objectives. Church accomplished a similar feat 3 years later in 1975 by protecting more than 650,000 acres in the Hell's Canyon National Recreation Area, which also included a similarly sized wilderness set aside. As Church's actions illustrate the role of the individual and the question of, so what can one person do? I think he illustrates very well that one person can make a huge difference. His ability to galvanize consensus ensured that these measures that he ultimately got passed were very bipartisan. They were very popular. He tried the best he could to create a win-win model of environmental legislation. It's what I like to call green pork. It not only works during the heyday of environmental legislation of the 1960s and 70s, but it also has the potential to maintain the fragments of political consensus that remain in this post-environmental era. It provides a model, really, for 21st century environmental cooperation. As one political reporter put it, in a democracy, everyone sitting around the table has to get something, meaning everyone has to give something. And that democratic ideal is bound up in the legislation that Frank Church helped to pass. Over the course of his 4 terms as a senator from Idaho, he often wrestled with balancing the conflicting demands of development and preservation in Idaho. But in the end, Church did not embrace environmental concerns because they were fashionable, but because he genuinely believed they were right. So thank you.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, fellow panel members. I'd like to mention some brief historic notes on the National Forest wilderness in Idaho, both the congressionally designated wilderness and also the de facto wilderness, the roadless areas, mostly prior to 1980. And then I'd like to advocate, or add my advocacy to what we've already heard, I think, today, for protecting some of the 9 million acres of National Forest roadless areas in Idaho. In 1927, Bob Marshall inventoried roadless areas of over 1 million acres, and he came up with 16 in the 48 states. The largest by far was the central Idaho roadless area of 7.6 million acres, 3 times the size of Yellowstone Park. The second largest roadless area was less than half that size, 3.4 million acres in northern Cascades. In 1931, the Forest Service designated, I don't want to use the word designated, classified or established the Idaho Primitive Area. In 1937, the Selway Bitterroot Primitive Area. In the mid-1930s, the CCC built the Magruder Corridor Road across the central Idaho Wilderness Primitive Area. It wasn't a primitive area yet. It was still just a chunk of roadless land from Darby, Montana to Elk City. Everybody awake? Bob Marshall, by 1939, had become the director of the Department of Recreation and Lands in the Forest Service, and he wanted to provide better protection for the primitive areas that the Forest Service had set aside, and also recommend. Jesus, sorry, I should quit gesticulating. So he came up with new regulations, and they were going to call these new areas wilderness areas if they were over 100,000 acres. We were down to 100,000 acres. So the Selway Bitterroot Primitive Area became known as the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness Area, but it was still a Forest Service classification, and as somebody earlier said, that was an administrative classification which could be removed with a stroke of a pen. In 1964, with the passage of the Wilderness Act, of course, the administrative Selway Bitterroot Wilderness became the congressionally designated wilderness area. And it had been the largest area, Forest Service such area in the country, but unfortunately, the year before the Wilderness Act passed, the Forest Service dropped 500,000 acres out of it. Notably, 300,000 acres in the Selway River drainage, the upper Selway drainage. Contrary to the recommendations of conservationists who've been urging them for years not to do that, they wanted to log the area. The upper Selway battle was a long-standing, and I hesitate to use the word epic, outstanding battle, went on from about 1954 to 1980. And of course, those who were active in that fight, I guess we've heard, were Mort Brigham of Lewiston and Doris Milner of Hamilton, Montana. Also involved were Bruce Bowler and Ernie Day of Boise, and Art Manley from Coeur d'Alene, who was a legislator, that rare bird, a conservation legislator from Idaho. They and many others persuaded Senators Church and Senator Lee Metcalf from Montana to become involved, and they in turn got Secretary of Agriculture Orville Freeman to appoint an independent committee to study the Forest Service plans to log the Upper Selway. The Selkie Committee held hearings in Boise, Grangeville, and Missoula in 1966. Boyd Norton was president of the Idaho Alpine Club over in Idaho Falls, and he persuaded Al McGlinskey, who was right here, I'm glad to say, along with Lee, and another fellow named Dick Wild and me to come over here to Boise to the hearing. It was my first hearing. I think it's where I first met Bruce Bowler and Ernie Day. Well, the Selkie Committee report, or the study and the report, put the brakes on the logging plan, but the area wasn't really safe until 1980, when, upon passage of the legislation with the River No Return Wilderness Area, the area south of the Magruder Corridor Road was added to that wilderness, and the area north of the road was added to the Selway Bitterroot Wilderness Area. And for more information on this issue and a lot of others, you should see Ken Robinson's new book, Defending Idaho's Natural Heritage, and I saw it for sale out in the hallway, in fact, glad to say. It's been mentioned by Dr. Dant, I think. The Sawtooth Wilderness Area was established in 1972, at the time when the Sawtooth NRA was established. The same year, the Forest Service did their first roadless area review and evaluation. RARE, R-A-R-E, in capital letters. The Forest Service is also starting to think about the future of the Idaho Primitive Area and the the Salmon River Breaks Primitive Area, which is the area north of the Salmon River but south of the Magruder Road. Conservationists also were thinking about those areas and starting to worry. The Idaho Environmental Council was formed in 1969, and that's about the main thing one of the main things that appeared on all of our agenda, Board of Directors meetings agendas. We started talking about it then and what to do about it. Maybe I should say a word. One of the founders of the IEC was Dr. Lyle Stanford, who was head of the biology department at the College of Idaho, a wonderful man, an ecologist before the word was even known what it meant. And we tried to, and I got dragged into the organization after a year or two of avoiding it. And we wanted him to be president, but he didn't want to take it, so I got further dragged into that position. Anyway, and by the way, Dennis Baird is a board member of the Environmental Council. It's a defunct organization now, so we just like to nostalgize a little bit. He's a board of director. And Ralph Maughan, who is here, I just saw him down here. I guess he disappeared. And Al McGlinskey. So there are four of us now, and I almost considered, as a past president, calling a board meeting together here. Well, the Forest Service public hearings were coming up in Idaho in 1973. The River No Return Wilderness Council was formed, another organization, that year by Bruce Bowler, Ernie Day, Tom Davis, and Ted Trueblood, and others. And they began to spread the word about this wonderful area in central Idaho and why we needed to protect it. And our Citizens River of No Return Wilderness proposal was born that year. It was February 24, 1973. Dr. Walt Blackadar, avid outdoorsman and kayaker, and another one of our board of directors, summoned conservationists from around the state of Idaho, and I'll motion with this hand, safer, Idaho and Montana, to come to his house in Salmon, Idaho, for a strategy meeting on the Idaho primitive area and the Salmon River Breaks primitive area. We hung a large map on the wall, 1/2 inch to the mile, of the two primitive areas, and proceeded to pool our knowledge about these areas and contiguous wild areas that we thought ought to be included in our proposal. I remember Carl Hocevar, our IEC Wilderness Chairman from Idaho Falls, standing at the map, wielding a large black marker, and as people talked about the contiguous areas, what they knew about them and why they thought they ought to be added, he would mark them off on here. And we wound up with, this is a copy of the 1973 map. We wound up with the two primitive areas in our proposal plus 13 contiguous areas, most of which were pretty logically defensible as being tributaries of the Middle Fork of the Salmon River. When we were done, the map looked a lot like a very large, many-lobed, asymmetrical amoeba. But anyway, it would be our River of No Return wilderness proposal. At 2.3 million acres, it would be the largest wilderness, national forest wilderness area in the 48 states. But there were 7 more years of hard work before we could win it. And finally, in 1980, after much citizen effort and the effort of Frank Church, Senator Frank Church, the bill to designate the amazing River of No Return wilderness area passed. I'm going to skip some more historic notes. Some of them you've already heard about. I'm not going to talk about Hell's Canyon, I guess. I don't have time. The Sawtooth Wilderness area. I talked about that, didn't I? In 1978, the Forest Service did RARE 2, Roadless Area Review and Evaluation. They developed a draft environmental impact statement, and then they developed several alternatives, none of which really proposed much wilderness to recommend to the Congress to act upon. So, citizens, again, we formed the Idaho Wildlands Defense Council, which included the Wilderness Society, Northern chapter of the Northern Rockies chapter of the Sierra Club, Conservation League, the Idaho Environmental Council, 2 Audubon chapters in Idaho, and others, developed Alternative W, which included our recommendations for about 4 million acres of wilderness out of the 9 million. We publicized this and sent copies to the politicians. In the 1980s, the Idaho Wildlife Federation and the Idaho Environmental Council added a few more roadless areas to Alternative W, so that our recommendation was now up to about almost 5 million acres of proposed wilderness. We were noticing that the Forest Service plans emerging were including a lot of new roads proposed. At one point in about 1986, there were Forest Service plans for over 20,000 miles of new roads in the National Forest of Idaho. 20,000 miles. There are now something around 240 roadless areas, National Forest roadless areas in Idaho, a total of 9 million acres. Most are small by Bob Marshall standards, but not all of them. As of 2005, there appeared to be 23 areas of over 100,000 acres each. And of course, this is more than most of the wilderness areas east of Wyoming, probably. We have to wonder now how much of this 9 million acres is going to survive. And if you think I'm hung up on acreage, as I probably am, but the values of a large area, of course, are fairly obvious when you think about it, not just for recreation, gives you really a chance to get away from it, but for wildlife. wildlife habitat increases almost exponentially with the increase in size of the undeveloped area. The preservation of diversity, biodiversity, the preservation of wildlife habitat is largely what motivates me. How much will survive? Well, that depends on us and you guys over there. Only persistent citizen action will save wilderness. Politicians won't touch wilderness bills, even the better ones, unless there is a great deal of strong and constant citizen pressure determined to save these areas. Given the current dysfunctional Congress, it's going to take a while. But I think we'll save more of it. Maybe the Boulder White Clouds will be the first. In Idaho, we have a wonderful contribution to the National Wilderness Preservation System and an opportunity to enlarge upon it. I think what we have now represents a good start. Thank you.
I'm going to jump right into it, fully cognizant I'm going to lose 2/3 of my audience in about 10 minutes as the school buses pull up. And I'd like you to at least hear part of this, because I think it might be most relevant to the young people here. The year 2014 saw two auspicious and interconnected birthdays. The year marked the 50th anniversary of the Wilderness Act and the actual birthday of a sled dog at Denali National Park, raised by the Student Conservation Association members in Alaska. Sarah talked about pandering. I'm absolutely shameless, borrowing cute puppy pictures to get your empathy. The new puppy will eventually range through much of the Denali Wilderness, protecting its wildlife and human citizens there. The new canine ranger was christened Zani, in commemoration of Howard Zahniser, perhaps the person most responsible for the Wilderness Act and a fellow mammal attuned to the beauty and value of wilderness. Now, Howard Zahniser is undeservedly less remembered today than other wilderness icons like John Muir and David Brower. Yet without Zahniser's long-standing lobbying and eloquence on behalf of wilderness, we wouldn't be celebrating a half-century of wild places today. Zahniser got his start in 1930 in the Bureau of Biological Survey, which evolved into the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. There for 12 years, Zahniser was a writer and an editor, and he honed his skills in communicating the value of nature to the public, utilizing, among other things, the hot new social media of the day, radio. Interestingly, one of his colleagues in the agency, also a writer and editor, was Rachel Carson, putting a lie to the tired bigotry of lazy or indifferent bureaucrats. In 1945, Howard Zahniser left the federal government and joined another former Fish and Wildlife Service colleague, Olaus Murie, to expand the public support and advocacy role of the decade-old Wilderness Society. From 1945 till his death in 1964, Zahniser was executive secretary of the Wilderness Society, editor of its influential and charmingly named magazine, The Living Wilderness, and the most effective and eloquent and energetic lobbyist for wilderness. For 6 years, from 1949 to 1955, Zahniser joined the bruising battle to prevent the Echo Park Dam from destroying much of the wilderness of Dinosaur National Monument. From that experience, he realized legislation would be needed to stop wilderness areas from being a perpetual battleground. Zahniser's efforts to pass a Wilderness Act were creative and unstinting. Always the editor, he began the first of what would become 66 drafts of the Wilderness Act. This numerous writing and rewriting by a master editor is why the act remains the most beautifully written piece of prose ever put in legislation, admittedly a low bar, and an act worth rereading by every aspiring environmentalist seeking the power of prose. Adding politics to his prose, Zahniser used every resource at his disposal to lobby for wilderness, including a special custom-tailored overcoat with extra-large pockets sewn on the inside so he could hold copies of wilderness legislation, books on wilderness, and other wilderness propaganda to hand out to congressmen, kind of like a conservation Captain Kangaroo. I can't explain it to the high school kids. They'll have to ask their parents. Zahniser even enlisted his 4 children to occasionally function as little lobbyists, handing out pamphlets to surprise congressmen during weekend visits to the Capitol. Like Moses, who was never allowed to see the Promised Land, Zahniser tragically died a mere 4 months before the signing of the Wilderness Act. However, Zahniser left us many legacies, including 109,511,038 acres of wilderness protected for future generations to enjoy. In his and my home agency, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, we now steward more than 20 million acres of designated wilderness in 75 wilderness areas, about 1/5 of the wilderness preservation system. They exist on 26 states and 63 refuges, and I'd like to talk about 2 of them. In fact, an interesting question is, what state had the first wilderness in the entire Department of Interior? You're right, you're all thinking New Jersey, and that's exactly where it was. The Great Swamp National Wildlife Refuge is located in Morris County, New Jersey, about 26 miles west of Manhattan's Times Square. The Great Swamp Refuge was established after years-long legal battles that pitted local residents against the Port Authority of New York and New Jersey, whose officials wanted to turn the swamp into a major regional jetport and heliport to help expand Newark Airport's capability. The Jersey Jetport Site Association was the first group to form in opposition, and their efforts were the early start to try to prevent development of the area. Another organization was set up shortly thereafter called the Great Swamp Committee in 1960, and the 2 groups began to lobby and fundraise vociferously, and in less than a year, they'd raised more than $1 million to purchase nearly 3,000 acres, enough property at the core of the swamp to donate to the federal government to create a national wildlife refuge in 1964. In 1964 was dedicated as a refuge, and additional lands continued to be added. The eastern half of the refuge was designated a wilderness in 1968, creating the first wilderness area in the Department of Interior. It's a wilderness area. In wilderness areas generally, no permanent structures, motorized vehicles, or equipment are allowed. Even mechanized forms of transportation like bicycles are prohibited. Hiking on approximately 8.5 miles of trails or free roaming is permitted. Hiking often turns into free roaming because the trails are very rustic. They're more like deer paths with itty-bitty signs. I was out there in October, and sure enough, I got lost, went from hiking to free roaming myself. Limiting use in this sensitive area to foot travel is one way to enhance the wilderness experience. The refuge staff has worked vociferously to remove any remaining traces of humans. Roads, old house sites, dumps have all been removed from the area. Drained wetlands have been restored. The wilderness area was purposely designed to provide a more primitive outdoor experience and appear as untrammeled as is humanly possible. The Great Swamp story illustrates one lesson, that in spite of claims to the contrary, wilderness can be created or at least recreated, and the stresses of modern urban living, like airport noise, can be assuaged by a wilderness in view of Manhattan's skyline. Now we're going to move to the opposite end of the North American continent and look at this refuge. Arctic National Wildlife Refuge is probably our most iconic wilderness refuge. It's our largest refuge at 19.6 million acres. That's the size of South Carolina, and 8 million of these acres are wilderness. It also mirrors the history of the Wilderness Act. Wilderness Society President Olaus Murie and our old friend Howard Zahniser began advocating for an Arctic refuge in the early 50s. In 1956, Olaus and his wife Marty Murie made an iconic film called Letter from the Brooks Range to fight for its survival. They took the social media of their day, which was portable 16mm projectors, to garden clubs and Audubon Society meetings and libraries and schools to campaign for Arctic's protection. And here's a clip from that film. It was a very slow-moving film, and to hell with it. In 1960, the film was very successful in spite of being a little slow, as you all saw, and the place was created as Arctic Game Range as part of the National Wildlife Refuge System. Then, in 1980, Jimmy Carter's Alaska Lands Act, along with his very progressive and very effective Secretary of Interior Cecil Andrus, led to a great expansion in the acreage and a huge addition of wilderness acreage. It's part of the ANILCA Act. Then, in 2001, Arctic Refuge came under threat of drilling as the new Bush administration sought expanded energy resources. So far, there's been no drilling, but wilderness advocates are always aware that they only need to lose once to lose their war for wilderness. Arctic National Wildlife Refuge reminds us that 90% of the Fish and Wildlife Service's wilderness is in Alaska, and much of it will remain inaccessible to all but the intrepid few. This fact challenges us to make people care about a place that they will likely never visit. It also raises the very real dilemma that as we place increasing value on wilderness, what pressures are we placing on non-wilderness areas? That is, are we just pushing natural resource extraction onto other lands that may also hold great value for their local citizens, but lie outside the protection of wilderness boundary signs? It's one of the true dilemmas we face as environmentalists, thinking about what happens to non-wilderness lands by virtue of the Wilderness Act. Although vastly different ecologically, Arctic National Wildlife Refuge and Great Swamp Refuges share an origin story in years of lobbying, political fights, and a context for wilderness creation often deriving from specific human and political needs. They also have inspired the allegiance of their proponents, both through the shared battle experience to create the wilderness and their more personal human experiences of enjoying these tranquil nature areas of, no pun intended, refuge. Yet in spite of being gathered here together to celebrate the 50th birthday of the Wilderness Act, there are almost certainly two sad realities that would trouble Zahniser and should trouble all of us in this room. The first is the undeniable fact that fewer and fewer young people are seeking out wilderness for spiritual growth. The idea of a place where all technology is banished seems antithetical to our contemporary lifestyle, where young Americans are increasingly enveloped in technology, from our Apple Watches soon to be around all of our wrists, to our ears attuned to iPhones, and eyes perpetually focused on iPads. Equally sad and little commented upon is how myopic our national vision has begun in the political realm as regards environmental regulations. In 1964, our American Congress passed the Civil Rights Act, the Land and Water Conservation Fund Act, and the Wilderness Act. And the latter passed 73-12 in the Senate and 373-1 in the House. The one nay vote reminding us there's always one kook in the room. The trick is not to listen to him. Who in this room today imagines any of these three bills would pass in the contemporary atmosphere, let alone with nearly unanimous votes in both houses? 50 years after Zahniser's death, we have puny dreams and we think small and petty as regards environmental legislation. We're a big country, and we should have an equally encompassing vision of both our environmental history, which I've covered, and also our pathway forward, so future generations can enjoy the gifts that men like Zahniser, Church, Murie, and Brower have bequeathed to all of us. And so I leave you on a note not of celebration, for I see much darkness in the present environmental scene, but rather a note of warning. Never forget, we must continue to fight and renew the struggle to protect the wilderness against the indifferent, against the venal, who would mistakenly have us believe that the only real values are narcissism and inquisitiveness, that the only real prophet is Adam Smith. The very real enemies of wilderness and the environment will use false dichotomies, they will use your indifference, they will use obfuscation to demean the value of its natural capital. And here, by contrast, I leave you with Zahniser's call to arms to fight for wilderness. This is what he said in 1964. We are not fighting a rearguard action, we're facing a frontier. We're not slowing down a force that inevitably will destroy all the wilderness that is. we're generating another force, never to be wholly spent, that renewed generation after generation will be always effective in preserving wilderness. We are not dealing with a vanishing wilderness, we're working for a wilderness forever. So to conclude, on the 50th anniversary of this act, let's not pat ourselves on the back, nor look back nostalgically to better days. Rather, let us renew our efforts to transform the political environment, to better protect our natural environment, and to make sure that we pass on to future generations, including those on the left side of this room, both an expanding and an enduring wilderness. Thank you very much.
Perfect time for everybody that has to leave from the various high schools to, thanks for coming, guys. And good luck in all those state tournaments. You might have a switch. Well, we'll see. I'll start talking and hopefully tell them to do it too.
I don't know much about Sennheiser.
Even though they're not here to hear it, I think there's some still here.
There, yeah, I took that out of my old magazines.
Well, the crowd just thinned out a little bit, unfortunately, but let's take the 20 minutes we have. Let me make a couple of quick summary points, and then Sarah suggested an interesting question we could start with. But the story here, obviously, is the combination of citizen activists, many of which we've heard in the Idaho story here, and congressional commitment. You don't get one without the other, I think, especially with wilderness. And with Alaska, and perhaps this will come up tonight, the reason the Antiquities Act is so much in play in the discussion over our own Boulder White Clouds as a potential path is simply it was used effectively in Alaska by Cecil Andrus and Jimmy Carter to force action to finally lead to an Alaska Lands Act bill being passed. One of the other quick points, and it plays off of what Mark said, it was again, I think, some members of Congress and Governor or Secretary Andrus and President Carter who astutely put in that bill that only Congress can open ANWR. Presidents cannot. One can only imagine if it had just been up to a president what might have happened since then. Sarah suggested a question, and there are students still here, and so maybe we can draw on the panel here. What can young people do to get involved and affect this as our knees get older and we get senile and everything? What can they learn to do to continue the action? If anybody here, both as historians or activists, might want to offer them words of encouragement or guidance and so forth.
Well, I'll certainly start on that one. And I thought that was a really great question that maybe we should have spent some more time on because the average age in the room just went up rather significantly with the departure of our students. But I think one of the things that I did say at the beginning of my comments was that you care about what you know. And the way to really begin to care about any of these wild places is to know them. And that's meaning both to get out in them, obviously. You've heard a lot of people say that they've spent their whole lives volunteering and then becoming increasingly involved in various campaigns, and that's where you have to start. Just start. Go pick somebody that you like. If you've heard something today that you're interested in, if you want to go talk to Rick Johnson, go talk to some of these people and say, okay, I'm interested. What do I do? How can use me and learn about a place? And then take classes. You know, I'm a history professor, so more shameless plugging here, but take classes in the environment. There's some terrific opportunities here at Boise State. Of course, you can always come to Weber. But take classes and learn, and that goes for people, I think, who are not typical college age or student age. Anyone can learn, and universities are terrific opportunities for people to get back in the classroom and learn something new about the place that you thought you knew really well. So we care about what we know, so learn about a place and decide that there's something you really want to care about, and realize that you don't have to necessarily spend your entire life, as some of these people have, but even if you spent a summer, you may find that has been a really terrific investment of your time and energy.
And universities have great internship programs, too, to get that real-world experience along with the classroom. Any of the rest of you want to add to what Sarah had to say? Jerry's thinking, I know.
Yeah, well, it's a slow process. I don't know if it's, well, probably not typical. I started hiking with these guys, with Al and Boyd Norton and Jack Barry, and they started dragging me around to the west slope of the Tetons and different places, and I learned that a lot of these areas that I was starting to love and love to hike in were under threat. What can we do about it? Well, I joined the Idaho Alpine Club. Maybe you've got outing clubs here that you can join. Start getting out and enjoying the areas, even if they're not under threat. The other thing is, you guys have the internet. I'd never heard of that, of course, until I was, a lot older. You can research some of the organizations before you jump in and join one, and see how good they sound, or wild or less wild, or too mealy-mouthed or whatever. Join an organization, especially if you've got a local chapter or something. That's about all I can say. It just takes it takes time for some people. You've got to work on it.
Yeah, and again, another quick example, just using here, we have an outdoor club. They're going to the Grand Canyon for 4 or 5 days between semesters. So you join that and you go, and it's one of those things everybody should do once in their life, I think. Did you have a comment or question? Do you want to go to the mic, though, or go ahead, do what you need to do, whatever that is.
One easy way, because sometimes it's not a summer or a month, sometimes it's just a day. Take advantage of the days that there are all these activities already put together and readily available, like National Trails Day, which is June 6th, or National Public Lands Day, which is in September. Some agencies do things on the 29th, but there's some things that are spread out throughout the month. Earth Day, you'll find people like you, not all looking like us, at those kinds of events, and you'll have fun. And that's what it's all about. If you're not having fun, you're not going to go back. So really, it is fun to go out and do those things and participate, whether it's picking up trash, which maybe isn't always fun, but you'll find out that you get to talking to people, and that's always fun. But it can also be trail building. It can be banding birds out in birds of prey. There are all sorts of things out there that are really pretty easy and not as intimidating as possibly going up to one of us and talking to us. So that's my 2 cents.
I have a brief comment.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Not to be the bearer of bad news, but this is the biggest challenge facing the overall conservation community. We know today's youth spend significantly less time outdoors. We know they're disconnected. They're largely urban. The demographics are changing from those in this room, and it's just a reality. And we don't have a good solution to it, but it is, I think, more dangerous than climate change. When people become indifferent to a resource or to a movement, we really risk damage. And I would ask all of you to think back how much time you spend outdoors as a young person, and those of you that are parents or grandparents, how much time your children or grandchildren spend outdoors, and that is the critical issue. And I'm as guilty of it as anybody else. I speak as a sinner here, but it's a huge issue. And the statement you made, I mean, the one advantage environmentalists always had, Abby said this, is we enjoy the environment, right? The anti-environmentalists don't. They're like Scrooge McDuck or whatever. But if we're not enjoying it, if we're not getting out there and doing stuff that was reflected on earlier by people that look like me and are my age, which is fishing and hunting and hiking, if people aren't doing that, if they're increasingly urban, we have to find new activities that get them outdoors. We've done it in the past through the Civilian Conservation Corps, other projects, but it's just not happening today. And we can We can tell them how great it is and so on, but the reality is you're not going out there. Remember in college when we were so worried people were going to love the national parks to death? Attendance has declined at national parks, something we never conceived of in the 80s and 90s. It just wasn't an issue. We figured they would always go up and eventually would smother places like Yellowstone and Yosemite. We're tipping back down. So it's a serious issue that we need to find a solution to, and I don't think anybody's cracked that nut yet.
Rocky, I know you're hiding in the River of No Return wilderness, but don't miss what I'm sitting with over here. College students, I think, right? High school, ha! It must be the Montessori High School. I just came from a conference, the big national conference in Albuquerque for all of last week. They only had 125 young people. But here's the deal. When I was a kid and you were a kid, we went backpacking in the local national forest and climbed the Cascades, in my case, because that's all we could afford. Today, 16, 18-year-olds have a passport, they're gone. They're in Patagonia and the Russian Federation and the steppes and South Africa in the Veld, and they'll be gone for 2 or 3 years. They'll come home, they'll settle down eventually, they'll raise a young family, and we'll see them in these wilderness areas. That's the reason we don't see them out there, and that's all there is to it. Furthermore, every child here and around the world is born with a love of nature. It's innate. We beat it out of them. We plug them in and strangle them in concrete buildings and in front of television sets, and and they aren't watching the nature specials. We've got to get kids back outdoors, and Tom and the Forest Service have been at the cutting edge of this. They have programs vigorously underway all over the country to get their folks and local volunteers to take kids to the woods from the youngest age. And it's the focus of the visitor center if you go to Tom's office in Washington. There are uncounted numbers of programs that take kids to the wilderness. I was talking last night at the airport in Albuquerque to a woman who runs a Montessori program, and she takes her kids out. The state of California has a law that says you can't have a live animal in the classroom. This is what we're doing. We're nuts. You can have only 5 dead ones. Something profoundly wrong, and we all need to get on a benighted governor, surprisingly. The Knolls. Every college and university in this country, including this one, I dare say, has an outings club. They go out year-round. Almost every college, I'll dare say, has a program where those who want to come early can register, can come 10 days before the college starts, and they go out with 10 of their people they never knew, and an upperclassman, and they raft, and they bungee jump, and God knows what else they do, in wild places, including a lot of wilderness and wild rivers. And they come back, they've got 10 lifelong friends. And they're not strangers, lonely on the campus. Wilderness does that. They aren't going to the Smithsonian, they're going to wild places. So, and in fact, I am trying to track down whether there's any national association of such groups. I know folks in a lot of them, but or some of them, but if there isn't, I'm going to organize it, and here's why. It is a ready-made, Rick, it is a ready-made political lobbying operation dispersed across every congressional district. There's a lot of places that don't have Mike Simpson. I can think of one pretty clear to where I'm standing.
Rick, before we get to you guys over there, how many of you hunt, fish, camp, spend time in the outdoors? Just show us your hands. See, there's hope. Isn't there hope? All right. Which high school is still here? Are you Centennial? Which one? Oh, okay. From Haley. Okay. Well, welcome. Rick, go ahead.
I just want to provide a little bit of a counter. I think part of the challenge is that issues come and go and things have rises and falls. The issue of the day is climate. We see young people engaged in that at the Idaho Conservation League all the time. I want to also say that we just had a job position the other day. We had 50 people applying for that, many young people. We have an incredibly robust internship program that brings in young people every single year. People fight for those internships, and they're young people. We also have an increasingly young staff, young people and also increasingly diverse. So I am heartened by what is going on in the environmental movement, but part of it is that we have to invite, we have to open the door, we have to kick the door open. Same thing that happened with women in the workplace has to happen with young people, people of different colors. But I believe it is happening because I live next to one of the city parks at Boise, and on a weekend some of the greatest use of that park are not the people that live there, not the middle class white folks, but the Hispanic community that is coming from other parts of the city to enjoy the open space. We have to alter how we think about it, we have to open the door, and we have to embrace the folks that come in. And I'm heartened by it. Yes, certain numbers are going down, but those are just the metrics we use for certain things. Their challenges are great, but I think we're headed not in a bad place. And I said earlier, I wake up every day as an optimist, and I can't help it. But we have to approach it that way.
To play off what Rick said, most of you probably knew that the president proclaimed the San Gabriel National Monument last week. This may be the first big urban national monument in American history. I went to college down there. I used to run all through those mountains. But the point is there's 25, 30 million people next to that national monument, and it's clearly going to be a different kind of available for all those cultures and types of folk that live in the greater LA area. So that's going to be really interesting to watch, and hopefully the Forest Service can get some budget increases to deal with that issue. Go ahead, sir. Oh, didn't see you, Pat. You're
right.
Quiet, Pat.
Thanks, John. I have a question for Dennis Baird. It's partly past-looking, but I think it's mostly forward-looking. I'm interested in your view on. In my experience the last 20 years, one of the enormous growth areas in Northwest conservation from the apprehension of people like me has been the increased power and force and sophistication of Indians, Indian tribes and Indian people. And it seems to me that's on an upward trend because they have things, they're just very good, a lot better now than they were, and they're more organized, and I think their power and their force is going to continue to rise. In your research, did Indians play any particularly great role in the legislative stuff and the Idaho wilderness creation stuff we've talked about? And then the forward-looking part of it is, am I roughly right, do you think? And do you see the Nez Perce tribe and others as increasingly impactful forces in the future of wilderness, wildlands, and the politics thereof?
Is this microphone on? Yep. Pat is absolutely right. My other role in life, besides being a retired professor and a conservationist, is I'm an historian, and I've worked with the Nez Perce tribe for 20 or 25 years on conservation matters and on history. And I'm currently employed by the Nez Perce tribe, for that matter. The Nez Perce tribe played a big role in the River No Return. They testified in favor of it. The Nez Perce tribe has been a strong proponent of Meadow Creek as wilderness for cultural reasons and because many tribal members have associations with Meadow Creek, the Selway River tributary, the great 200,000-acre roadless area. And the Nez Perce tribe in particular has resisted a zillion efforts to be bought off by Bonneville, to take the money and run. To a person, they have said, what we want is fish, we want clean water, we want good hunting, we want a nature that we can appreciate and value. They have turned down every single offer, and these were serious cash offers to buy them off. So those of us who are here, who are in the conservation community, we probably underappreciate the power of American Indian tribes, especially those in Idaho, who are generally very good stewards of the land, as allies. And I can testify, having been at it for 40 years, that it's a slow go getting the trust of Nez Perce tribes, because when white folks like me show up, we're always there to take something from them. There's a rich history of that, and white scholars are among the biggest thieves of all. So we're distrusted from day one, but it's trust worth building because there's a tremendous potential ally. The Nez Perce tribe also, I should tell you, has a wonderful, we were talking about young people and children. There's a Nez Perce Tribes Appaloosa Horse Club, which is all children. And next summer, I think it's going to be a go. We're going to take a bunch of Nez Perce kids on horses on my other long-term project, which is reopening the Southern Nez Perce Trail, the camping trail, the ancient trail across the Magruder Corridor. And so the Nez Perce children next summer will be able to enjoy the Magruder Corridor, they'll be able to enjoy the Meadow Creek roadless area, potential wilderness, and ride horses, Appaloosa horses, on a 9,000-year-old Nez Perce trail. So perfectly right about American Indians.
Probably time for one more.
Yeah, thank you. I just work part-time in the outdoor industry for a large outdoor retailer. Won't say the name. But one thing I've noticed is we've really focused a lot on technology in the outdoors. Like right now, there's a wood-burning stove that you can power up your phone with, that we actually sell. It's not doing work that great yet. But that's where we're going. And so it's interesting to see how the outdoor industry is we're not bashing or going against the technology thing at all. That the idea with the mission of our place is to get people outdoors any way possible. And so I think a lot of the young people who tend to do stay inside, if they realize that they can have their computer outside, I mean, that's fine. I don't think we'd have any problem with that. So, and also we have, incredible solar power chargers now that we can carry with us. And so people just love that. So, I don't know if y'all wanted to comment on that, but that's exciting.
Can I comment, John?
Fire away.
Yeah, look, it's a 50th anniversary, and the reason to have a conference like this is to ask hard questions. And I'm really glad you're all optimistic, and I am too. I was a Peace Corps volunteer. I'm very idealistic. But I think this technology issue, talking about urban monuments and talking about tribal lands, doesn't necessarily deal with the demographics we're seeing in the 21st century. And we have urbanized youth. A national monument, just like a national wildlife refuge or a park, in an urban environment is not wilderness. And I think we need to think hard, and it may well involve technology, how we engage young people. I think we need to ask harder questions. Everybody we've looked at, from Church to Brower to Zahniser to Muir, they all spent a heck of a lot of time in nature and in wild areas. If the current generation is spending less time there have to be new techniques to get them out there. They're also, we haven't talked about this at all, incredibly politically disengaged for reasonable reasons. They read the newspaper or read it online, and how do we overcome that? And Gaylord Nelson, the Earth Day, that came up again and again. That's how a lot of us got energized. Where is that idealism today? Where the heck, are the Udalls? Where are the Nelsons? These are huge challenges, and at midlife, which is the age of the Wilderness Act, that's what we should be looking for. I think wilderness will be here. It's tied to the U.S., but it's a tougher time in many ways than it was in the 60s. And I think the next generation, it's challenging, and especially with the 50% of Americans that are going to be Latino, Black, Asian, non-white. We really need to push those numbers up, to open the doors, like Rick said, to people that aren't going out there in the numbers that we are. We need to think hard about that and be realistic about that.